Good evening. Welcome to the American Society Council of the Americas and the book launch for a friend of the American Society Council of the Americas, a friend of Latin America, and I think probably, if you know it or not, a friend to all of you if you ever read The Economist. I think since I don't have bylines, many of you have probably read more of Michael Reid's work than you probably even realize. Michael lived in Brazil from 1996 to 1999. And as he reveals in his book, he has a very, I think, abiding affection for the people and the culture that we'll talk about a little what this means in terms of his predictions for its future. But from there, he went to become the Americas editor at The Economist and worked there until 2013. While there, and I don't know how he found the time, he also wrote a great book, The Forgotten Continent, about Latin America, which I think has had 2 editions. How many editions are there? 2 or 3?
Well, it's been in paperback and hardback, and I haven't done a second edition.
Okay,
it's. I need to. That's the next.
Didn't mean to give you any more work. But I actually teach it in my class at Columbia. It's a great primer. And then now he's the Bejo columnist for The Economist, which it seems to be, from the way he just described it to me earlier, probably the best job in the world, getting to wander around Latin America, report on all things that interest him. We're here tonight to discuss his new book, Brazil, which the timing couldn't be better. For those of you who have been locked in a closet for the last couple months, we're at the eve of the World Cup, which starts tomorrow in Brazil. So I think we'll be talking about some soccer and talking about some predictions for the tournament, as well as predictions for Brazil's future. So what we'll do is Michael's going to talk for a little while about the book, and then I'll ask him some questions about the book, and then I'll open it up for you, and there'll be a reception afterwards. So, Michael, tell us a little bit.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much to the Council and the American Society for having me here once again in this wonderful hall, and thank you all for coming. I may be one of the very few people who has a kind of sneaking sympathy for the plight of the Brazilian authorities as they rush to complete the stadiums and the transport things and so on, because I know what it's like to have the World Cup as a deadline. Yeah? I mean, last year, as I was struggling to get this book finished while also doing a day job, I kind of once or twice asked myself the same question that I imagine the Brazilian authorities have asked themselves: why on earth did I get into this? You know? And the reason is that I think that, you know, while there has been a growing realization in the past few years that kind of Brazil matters, it is, after all, the world's 5th largest country by area, the 4th most populous democracy, the 7th largest economy. And yet there is, for such an obviously important country, a remarkable degree of unknowing about it in Europe and the US, compared with, say, the amount of books that have been written about the other BRIC countries. No? And that lack of knowledge about Brazil sort of shows up, you know. When George W. Bush was at the start of his presidency, and Fernando Henrique Cardoso, then the president of Brazil, went to visit him in the White House for the first time, Bush said to Cardoso, "Tell me, do you have many black people in Brazil?" And well, fortunately, Condoleezza Rice was present and immediately saved your country's honor by stepping in and giving, you know, a very knowledgeable explanation of Brazil's racial makeup. But Brazil actually has more people of African descent than any other country in the world except Nigeria. Also, if you have been at all aware or following the kind of reporting on Brazil in the run-up to the World Cup, you might be forgiven for thinking that almost all Brazilians live in favelas. In fact, according to the 2010 census, only 6%, or less than 12 million Brazilians, live in favelas. It's true that 22% or 1.5 million in the city of Rio de Janeiro live in favelas. And it's also true that many Brazilians who don't live in favelas live in poor housing. But I think that's very revealing of the way that the image of Brazil abroad is very, very much refracted through the lens of favela crime and favela chic in Rio de Janeiro. And Brazil is a country of 200 million people, and Rio is just one city in it. I think, so why is there this relative degree of unknowing about Brazil? It may be because Brazilians speak Portuguese, not Spanish. Outsiders have a sense, well, it's just another Latin American country, albeit the biggest one. And yet Brazil actually has a rather different history and geography than the rest of Latin America, and not just because of the language. In many ways, it resembles more the United States in a distorted mirror. No? It has, after all, had the kind of open frontier has been important in Brazilian history just as it was here, slavery. Everything in Brazil is big, as it is in the US, including portion sizes, in restaurants. And Brazil has the same sense of exceptionalism that the US has. I mean, Brazilians kind of deep down know their country is special. And it is, I think. And I think that kind of difference of Brazil, that apartness, comes from its history. And that's why I devote about a third of the book to history. And I would just quickly highlight three features of that history. Firstly, it was colonized by Portugal, not by Castile. And Portugal was a relatively weak colonial power, small country, which found itself having this vast colony, and its hold over Brazil was threatened at various periods quite seriously by the French and the Dutch, for example. And from that came a state in Brazil which, in order to ensure its control over the territory, always cut deals with the local potentates of whatever description, And that kind of consensual state has been a central feature or that consensus between the state and the political elites has been a feature of Brazilian history ever since. It was a difficult country to settle. I mean, it's a largely tropical country, and that posed enormous obstacles until the last few decades. Sorry. The rivers all flow in unhelpful directions. There's no Mississippi in Brazil. And, just to cite one trivial example, which I describe in the book, you had to deal with the dreaded sauva, who are these leaf-cutting ants who are capable of stripping a field of cassava in 2 nights and who build these vast underground burrows of kind of green gunge and discourage you from investing in agricultural modernization. No? The other thing was that there was a lack of sophisticated indigenous civilizations of the kind that there were in the Andes and in Mexico. And the upshot was that slavery was incredibly important in Brazil. And I think most people, and this is I'm obviously speaking to a knowledgeable audience here, but most people just do not realize that of the 10.5 million Africans who were forcibly transported and and those who landed in the Americas, of the 10.5 million, 4.9 million were landed in Brazil, so almost half. And that is 12 times more than in the US, for example. So slavery was fundamental. And one of the things, slavery took different forms than in the US. It never involved segregation. The Portuguese, unlike the British, actively mingled and procreated with Africans and indeed with indigenous people. So race in Brazil is a spectrum. It's not binary at all, and that's very important to bear in mind. But I think one of the legacies of slavery is a persistent current of violence in Brazilian society. Not in Brazilian politics, but in Brazilian society. Brazilian politics, because of this consensual relationship between the state and the elite on the one hand, and on the other hand, because of the unique circumstances in which independence came about, in which a European monarchy took ship and landed in Brazil, and it was the Portuguese monarchy that proclaimed independence in Brazil, and Brazil was an independent monarchy for 70 years. That means that Brazil as a country is not a country of revolutions. It's a country of gradual evolutionary political change. And that state that has played such a central role was responsible in the 20th century for 50 years of very rapid economic growth. And between 1930 and 1982, Brazil probably grew faster than anywhere else in the world, along with Japan and Venezuela. And then it all ended in distortions and tears of inflation, debt, and there was a military government in control by then. So when Brazil became a mass democracy for the first time in 1985, the democratic politicians faced some big challenges on the economy, but they also faced a huge social lag that was in part the legacy of slavery, but it was in part because of the fact that the state subsidized production and subsidized business rather than investing in people, if you like, in health and education and so forth. So in 1985, Brazil had a striking lag in all the social indicators for a country of its income per head. At first, democracy floundered in Brazil. If you read the political science literature that was being produced, particularly in this country, in the late 1990s, when I arrived in Brazil in 1996 to live there, and it was uniformly gloomy. The field work had been done in the early 90s or at the end of the 80s. It was uniformly gloomy about the prospects of democracy actually working in Brazil and actually being able to tackle the country's problems. And then things turned around, and Brazil had 2 decades of remarkable progress under 2 remarkable leaders, remarkable in different ways. First, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, whose Real plan killed inflation, stabilized the economy. He began to dismantle the traditional corporate state in Brazil and open up the economy to the outside world. And he began to invest in people. And then Lula, whose election symbolized that democracy could involve social inclusion. And he proceeded through much more ambitious social policies and some helpful winds from the outside the world economy to preside over faster growth and a lot of social progress. So that in the last 2 decades or so, some 40 million Brazilians have left poverty. Income inequality, which was extreme, has been falling steadily for a dozen years, though it still needs to continue to fall at the same rate for the next 2 decades for income inequality in Brazil to be at a similar level to the United States. And if Monsieur Piketty is correct, then maybe the United States is moving in Brazil's direction. And then the middle class, which on a realistic definition, the World Bank's definition of having an individual disposable income of between $10 and $50 a day per head. That middle class has grown from 15% in 1990 to a third of the population today, so it's more than doubled. Now, in the last 4 years, that progress has slowed noticeably. And I think most Brazilians feel disappointed with the Dilma Rousseff's government. I think as a person, Dilma has many qualities. I think she hasn't, as a politician, she hasn't managed the economy as well as her predecessors did. It's true, you could argue that the straying from the straight and narrow path of economic management began in the second Lula government, because I think Lula and the ruling Workers' Party drew the conclusion from the 2008 financial crisis that the Beijing consensus had won, had triumphed, and the Washington consensus had failed. And so they have intervened more in the economy. They've done it in a very Brazilian way. I mean, it hasn't been disastrous. It hasn't been Venezuela, nor anything like that, you know. But I mean, there's no doubt it is not. They have lost the confidence of investors and of private business, and investment and saving have lagged. And then last June, Brazil saw these remarkable spontaneous protests, which at their height involved around 1 million people, mainly from the middle class, both new and old, but according to opinion polls, supported at their height by around 80% of the population. And I think those protests are a turning point in Brazil. I think they're a turning of the political tide, and I think they represent the voicing from below of a new political agenda in the country. Because I think their central meaning was, and this is a backhanded tribute to the success of the Workers' Party governments, that people are no longer as what, and Brazil has for practical purposes, full employment. Real wages have increased steadily and a lot over the last dozen years. And people's main worries now are public services, or the lack of them, the poor quality of healthcare, of education, of public transport, and crime, and the poor quality of policing. And so the protests were, at heart, a demand for a different kind of state that uses public money in a different way. Because Brazil collects between 36 and 38% of GDP in taxation, which is a similar level to a similar proportion to this country, and yet, or to the OECD average, and yet Brazilians too often get third world public services. And the Confederations Cup, the warm-up tournament for the World Cup, highlighted that a lot of money, and a lot of public money, was going on stadiums. And I think many Brazilians think that the fact that the World Cup is being held in 12 cities when 8 would have been more than enough, the fact that a lot of money is going to stadiums, and the country's been slower to do the promised public transport improvements, that they think that is a consequence of a political system which is skewed too much in benefit of, to the benefit of insiders rather than of the mass of citizens. 21 separate parties are represented in the Brazilian Congress. There's a political science index of effective parties in legislatures, in other words, ones that have some significance, and Brazil comes top with 11.5. Even Israel, which is notoriously fragmented, only has 7. And this political system has too many veto players who grab a slice of the action, as it were, in return for their cooperation. And the result is that Brazil spends too much on vested interests. They include public sector pensioners, for example, and pensions in general. Brazil spends as big a share of national income on pensions as, although it's demographically a young country, as Greece. And it spends too much on the kind of machinery of government, not so much the federal bureaucracy, but particularly at kind of municipal level and so forth. And it still gives subsidies to privileged economic groups. So I think there's a demand, the protests represented a demand for the reform of the state and reform of the political system. I think it's to Dilma's credit that she has always upheld the right to peaceful protest in a democracy, and in that she contrasted with Erdogan in Turkey, who at the same time adopted a very different approach to peaceful protest. But I think that, I mean, it was interesting, and before the protest there was talk in Brazil of Lulismo, because Lula is such a remarkable political figure and such a popular political figure, of Lulismo having produced a lasting political realignment in Brazil. I think Lulismo doesn't really have the answers to the questions that the protesters were posed, because the basic question is that the corporate state needs reforming. The corporate state laid down in the 1930s and 40s by Getúlio Vargas, the corporate state against which, paradoxically, Lula rebelled as a leader, a strike leader of an unofficial strike and an unofficial union. He was quintessentially an insurgent against the corporate state. And yet the PT has ended up making its peace with the corporate state and becoming a pillar of it. So I think that means that the election in October, which is actually more important for Brazil's future than the World Cup, I think the election is wide open, and I think any of the three candidates could win. And I think clearly the World Cup has shone a very bright light on Brazil's failings and shortcomings, which are real, and I discuss them in the book. The country is pretty hopeless at carrying out infrastructure projects, and it needs to get much better at that. And there is a deep mood of discontent in Brazil, which goes beyond the World Cup. There is a crime problem. Policing is very poor in many parts of the country, even if it has actually got better. Until very recently in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, the tendency over the last 20 years has been very positive. But I think that bright light that has been shone on the country's weaknesses is only half the story. And I think there's a much more positive story of the way in which Brazil has faced very big challenges, and democracy in Brazil has overcome them. There is, and I will wind up now, there is in the subtitle of the book a little bit of journalistic license. The subtitle is The Troubled Rise of a Global Power. I think Brazil is not yet a global power, but I have to sell books, and I think it clearly has the potential to be a global power, and it has the ambition to be a global power. And I think we need to think about what kind of global power it would be. I think it's, I have a chapter about foreign policy in the book. I think Brazil has had some successes in foreign policy. I think it's also clearly had some failings, and I'm happy to discuss that more. But to sum up, I think Brazil in the last 20 years has found a path towards becoming a more prosperous country and for the first time, and I think this is expressed, this is the other central meaning of the protest. The protests are a demand for a democracy of citizens, not a democracy built from the top down. And I think it's moving along a path towards becoming a democracy of citizens, a more middle-class society, a more prosperous society, a more developed country. But I think to get there, I think the pace of progress has slowed in the last few years. I think to get there, I think it needs another round of reform, of economic reform. The economy is far too closed. The notorious custo Brasil, the Brazil cost, has to be tackled. Everybody who's tried to do business in Brazil knows that the country is prohibitively expensive. That's to do with the tax burden, interest rates, poor infrastructure, poor education, the labor laws, red tape, and all the rest of it. So I think whether or not Brazil manages to, I mean, what's at stake in the next few years is whether Brazil gets caught in what economists call the middle income trap or not. And to get out of the middle income trap, it needs to move to a situation in which it's investing more, saving more, and productivity is rising, and it's investing more in its citizens. And I think that's possible. I think, but it's by no means a done deal. And there are lots of things I haven't mentioned, which I'm happy to talk about, but I think I've gone on for long enough, so I'll stop now. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I have three questions, and then I'll throw it open. The first is let me just push you a little bit more on what these changes would be. Or you talked about the Costa Brasil. I mean, what is, first of all, on the structural reform side, what is going to be necessary to open up the institutions, to make them more efficient, to reduce the cost? And then how will this happen in a political system that, as you imply, is very hidebound? I mean, for all of the excitement about Lula's election, I mean, you say basically they made their peace with the corporatist state, a highly fragmented congressional system, a very decentralized federal system. What is necessary to sort of make that system sort of work and take the very dramatic steps it has to take to address some of these things? Reduce pension. Pension reform is a huge.
Yeah, well, I think there are, I mean, that's a huge question. I mean,
we've only got a couple hours.
And I will, let me take it in parts. I mean, let's start with the economy. And I think there, first things first. I think the first thing that needs to happen is that I think the confidence of investors, both market investors and business investors, in the predictability of the macroeconomic framework needs to be restored. And I think that's been undermined in the last few years by Dilma's pressuring of the central bank on the one hand, by the failure to, the lack of transparency over the fiscal target on the other hand. I think that is fairly easy to fix. A new team, it's fairly easy to fix if the opposition wins. It's harder if Dilma wins, because she may not think that it's a priority. But that's the first thing, and that would help quite a lot. Then I think you need to go through the Brazil cost and tick off the things on the list. Now, they involve negotiating with very powerful entrenched vested interests, and you need to start at the beginning of the new government, and you need to pick which you think is the priority. I think it's worth saying that at the same time, this government finally did get its act together to an extent on infrastructure, and there will be quite a lot of new infrastructure coming on stream in the next few years. That needs to continue. It needs a lot more of it, but that will start helping. And then the other thing, which I didn't mention, I mean, Brazil has some basic underlying strengths. It's agribusiness, obviously, but oil and energy and oil as well. Now, you can argue that the government has made extracting the pre-sal oil more expensive and slower than it might have been, but it will eventually come in. Now, I think there's a risk there that undermines the incentive to reform, and I think part of the problem for Brazil is that it's not heading for collapse. It's the economy is still basically strong. The central bank has $340 billion of reserves, and so on. So it will require considerable political leadership. I mean, the other thing I would say is political reform is essential, but very difficult. I mean, Dilma's response to the protest was, let's have a constituent assembly. Well, unfortunately, that's unconstitutional in Brazil, and she hadn't asked her vice president about before she made the suggestion, and he's a constitutional lawyer, and he said, we can't do this. So she said, well, let's have a referendum. Now, the problem is, how can you have a referendum about political reform when you don't know what the question is, when lots of different parties and different groups in the society have different questions and different answers? So if you have a referendum, you risk having a result a bit like that children's game where you do a head and then a body and then legs and you pass them around, and you get some weird creature that doesn't fit together, right? So the only way to do it is in Congress. So how do you get turkeys to vote for Christmas in Congress? Because the people who are in Congress have got there through the existing system. I think the two basic things that have to happen is that you have to raise the threshold for a party to get representation in Congress, and at the same time, if a new party is formed, it doesn't inherit the legacy rights of its previous constituent parties or members from them. And the second thing that has to happen is that at the moment, the lower house of Congress is elected on a system where each state is a single constituency. So nobody knows who their congressman or woman is. You need to break those down into smaller constituencies of 5 or 6 members, whatever, and with PR. It's tough, but I think Brazil has to try. And I think the thing that gives me most hope is actually the fact, not the protests now, because I think the protests have changed their character, but the protests last year, because they express a widespread demand for the system to change. And Brazil is a democracy, and public opinion matters. And so while I'm not optimistic that it'll all get done, I'm not pessimistic that none of it will get done.
My second question is on diplomacy. A very interesting chapter that captures, I think, a lot of the contradictions in Brazil's sort of foreign policy over the last 2 administrations, some of the consistency as well, and it sort of grounds it very much in history. But you talk cases of Iran and others. Explain a little bit how Brazil sees the United States and how it sees itself in the relationship with the rest of the world. This sort of emphasis, as you talk about, on sort of representing the global South, and as part of that, sort of being a defender of national sovereignty, but often that comes into conflict with its own purported defense of human rights, whether it's in the case of Venezuela or in Iran. So explain a little bit the evolution of Brazil's foreign policy and the internal contradictions within it.
Well, for a long time, Brazil was an ally of the United States. I mean, in many ways, the US's best ally in the Americas. I mean, until this, it was the only country that declared war on the Allied side in both world wars. It was the only Latin American country to send troops to Italy, to send troops to the war effort, and it was a believer in Pan-Americanism. It then felt that it didn't get its due reward after the Second World War. It was cut out, and it feels it was cut out of the kind of post-war world order, and tensions began to rise. Particularly in the 1970s, under the military government, when Brazil began to see itself more as a representative of the global South, in inverted commas, because of course China is not in the South, nor Russia. And there's a kind of very strong Western gene in Brazil, but there's a Southern gene as well, and they sometimes clash, or rather, one is sometimes in the ascendant and the other is sometimes in the ascendant. Clearly the Southern gene has been in the ascendant for the last dozen years. But I think, Brazil has had some successes from that policy. I think its Africa policy is very positive. It's an influential player in Africa. I think it's a force for good in Africa. I think the China relationship, clearly it's economically very, very important, but it's full of frictions. And Brazilian manufacturers feel that the Chinese are eating their lunch, basically, unfairly, and they may be wrong to think it's unfairly, but that's what they think. And on the other hand, there are two kind of central problems in Brazil's foreign policy. The first is the region, and the second is the US. In the region, Brazil has kind of wanted to be the leader of South America and wanted to call the shots in the region and not have the US call the shots in the region. But on the other hand, it hasn't. On the other hand, it's been a reluctant leader in many ways. It hasn't been clear about what its project for its neighbours is. And it's been too ideologically biased, in my view, in the last few years. Mercosur has become a protectionist club for kind of bear hugs amongst friends, the formation of the Pacific Alliance, I think, is a tacit rejection of that approach. And so if Brazil is really to be the leader of South America, then it has to open up its market much more to its neighbours, and it has to start going back to building regional integration through a rules-based approach, rather than that reflects lasting national interest, rather than just fleeting ideological solidarity. And then there is the US. But I think the problem for Brazil is that Brazilian industry, because of the form that Brazilian foreign policy has taken, risks, and it feels this increasingly, being cut out of global value chains. So with the US, the US is, at the end of the day, the largest single market for Brazil's manufactured goods, and it could be, the economic relationship could be much closer. The US is sometimes to blame for the frictions in the relationships, But there is a basic problem that each side wants different things, I think. The US essentially wants a more open market in Brazil to sell into. It wants Brazil to be the sheriff of South America. Brazil's reluctant on both those things. Brazil wants the US to see it as a global power, and it wants to be consulted and taken seriously on global issues. And the US doesn't do that because it thinks on the issues that are at the top of the US's own agenda that Brazil is either not a relevant or not a constructive player. So I think the relationship is it's not bad, it's just full of frustration and disappointment. No?
Last question, a relatively simple one compared to my last broad ones. You expressed some misgivings about Dilma's chances in the elections in October. Explain. Do you really think we're looking at a real race? I mean, that was your column a few weeks ago.
I think the election is wide open, and I think any three of the candidates could win. And I think if I were Dilma now, I would be very worried. Because what matters at this stage in a Brazilian election is not what the opinion polls show about the voting intention, because Brazilians, like all sensible people, are not thinking about the election at the moment. They're actually thinking about the World Cup. But I mean, again, like all sensible people, the thing that would worry me if I was Dilma is that I think the most important thing in the opinion polls is that they consistently show, and have done for the past few months, that 60 to 70% of respondents say they want the next. If you're asked the question, do you want the next president to be like Dilma or do you want them to be different from Dilma, 60 to 70% say they want them to be different. Now, some of those people want Dilma to be different, but that's a clear demand for change.
Do they want her to be more like Lula? Is this also mean...
Lula is more popular than Dilma. And if you're Dilma, I mean, her strengths are that she's got a strong bedrock of loyal support, which is loyal support for Lula, because particularly poorer Brazilians are grateful to Lula because they saw him as one of us who helped us. And you talk to ordinary Brazilians and they will say Lula did this, that, or the other, which was helpful to us, and nobody'd done anything before, right? That is a powerful advantage. She's also an incumbent, and she'll have more television time, free television time. She's got more money. But in the northeast, which is 50 million people, that's a quarter of the population. I mean, she's got a solid bedrock of support. But why do I think she might well lose? Because of the demand for change. Because I think it's clear the election will go to a second round, and in the second round, it's actually a much more equal contest. Either side could win. And particularly if Eduardo Campos gets into the second round, he's a centrist figure with Marina Silva, who is a very popular former founder of the PT, who in many respects has a better claim than Dilma to be Lula's heir, I think, and he's from the northeast. I mean, he could win. I think AEC could also win, but it might be tougher. But the other reason that I think the opposition has a real chance is that the campaign hasn't started. And both the opposition candidates, Eduardo Campos and AEC Neves, are still not household names across Brazil, and they will become so in the campaign. And in Brazil, it's a big country, and name recognition is very important, I also think that if you're Dilma, in Dilma's situation, and you're in the campaign, and the campaign will start in earnest after the World Cup at the end of July, and if you're in the lead and you're falling, that creates a difficult dynamic. And I think you've seen in the last couple of months that Dilma is falling and the opposition candidates are rising. So, I insist that the election is wide open, and I think that many analysts here and in Brazil have not grasped that.
We'll open up for questions. Questions? John Moncourt from the Financial Times.
Mike,
another fine British publication.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting theme, the one you're on right now. If there is a large number of people who think that some sort of major event would have to take place for Dilma to be defeated. She's got the Bolsa Familia, she's got a big part of the Northeast vote, et cetera. if there was a big event, what would it have to be? I mean, besides Brazil losing in the first round, is it the social unrest, reaching some unprecedented level? Do you see an event like that being the catalyst to dethrone the PT, or not necessarily? Doesn't sound like.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that any analysis of an election 4 months before it happens, there's lots of room for events, right? I think the problem for Dilma is that if Brazil wins the World Cup, which I think it might, Brazilians will be euphoric for a week or two, but A, it'll wear off, and B, Brazilians, like everybody else, have multiple identities. When they cast a vote for who's going to run the country in the next 4 years, they're not actually thinking, wow, we won the World Cup, I mean, they're actually thinking about their everyday lives. If Brazil were to lose in the first round, as you suggested, I think that would play into the national feeling of pessimism, which is very pronounced in Brazil at the moment, and that's bad for Dilma. So
only downside risk, really.
I think so. I think there's only a downside risk, the thing if I were her, the thing I would worry about is the investigation into corruption in Petrobras. Not because she's personally corrupt, because I don't for a moment think she is. I mean, I think she's an honest person of personal integrity. But she was in charge of, as energy minister, she was the chairwoman of the board of Petrobras when this stuff went on. I'm sure she didn't know about it, but I mean, she was in charge, and I think that's quite damaging. If there are more revelations and so on about mismanagement and corruption in Petrobras.
Questions?
Well, it's a question combined with a statement. I am a big fan of your columns in The Economist, by the way, and all the facts are very accurate and very rich in its content. But I'm always stunned by the lack of something that actually undermines everything in terms of macroeconomics and microeconomics, which, if there are any Brazilians here, they would, I think, agree with me, which is the complete lack of confidence most Brazilians have in how the government is run. I'm talking about corruption and impunity. So it's comparable to us here being the Congress of the US. If our first and foremost interest is actually becoming richer, ourselves and our families, no matter how brave or how intelligent we are, it's not going to work. So why is that this most predominant problem in Brazil, corruption, rampant corruption, does not come to the surface more as the #1 problem that we actually have in Brazil? Because that's what it is. Why can't we just openly talk about it?
Well, I think it has come to the surface, to be fair. I mean, I think, the Mensalão case meant that, corruption really has come to the surface. I think it was a central demand in the protest, because, I mean, people are saying not just that public money is being spent on the wrong things, but too much public money is being stolen one way or another. And I agree with you. I think that is a central demand of Brazilians. I think the Mensalão case was terribly important because it showed that you have an independent judiciary in Brazil that was not afraid of, you at least have some independent judges who were not afraid to take on leading figures in the ruling party. But I think the Sao Paulo media were wrong to suggest that the Mensalão, that the PT has a monopoly of corruption. Of course it doesn't. It goes much, much wider. And it has very deep roots, and that's another reason why I think you need to look at one needs to look at Brazilian history. And I talk about the way in which right from the beginning there's been this kind of self-serving confusion of private and public interest amongst the Brazilian elite. And now, I actually think democracy is the antidote to that, because I think that the antidote to corruption is transparency, and that comes from a free media, and it comes from prosecutors have much more power since the 1988 Constitution, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary now, which has many flaws, but it had some good things in it. So I agree with you that it's a huge problem. I think it's harder to say whether it's getting worse or it's just becoming more visible.
Mr. Reid, good evening. I was wondering, you mentioned economic reforms. So more on the monetary policy, what do you recommend central banks should do? Because I know they last May the left interest rates changed, but however you see inflation, which is not even within what central banks consider even, which is like from 2.5 to 6.5%. Right now it's around 6.7% the inflation rate in Brazil. So what do you recommend in the monetary policy the government should do? And if you have any thoughts on fiscal policy, that'd be great. Thanks.
Well, I think, you know, I mean, the tendency inflation has started to come down, right? After it being very stubbornly at the top end of the target range. But, you know, why is that? Because they've had to almost kill the economy, you know? I mean, almost tip the economy into recession because they had to raise the interest rate. So the central bank had to raise the interest rate far more than it would have had to have done because the central bank had lost credibility, and you know, and Dilma was responsible for that, I'm afraid. So has Tombini, the president of the central bank, regained credibility? I think he's regained quite a lot of credibility, actually. But I mean, I think, you know, the main thing is that people need. I mean, you can, you know, you can do all kinds of things. Even being on the left, you can do all kinds of things as long as you retain the trust of the markets. You know, once you lose the trust of the markets, as you know, many people here know, it becomes hard to win it back, and it becomes it's much easier to lose it than to win it back. So I think if Aécio Neves comes in and Arminio Fraga becomes finance minister, which he would, I think, you know, Arminio has enormous credibility and in the markets, and I think, you know, problem solved. If Dilma wins, well, you know, I have both called publicly in print for Dilma to sack Mantega, and then I said please keep him because she ignored my advice the first time. But I do assume that Mantega will go. Now, an awful lot would depend on who she appointed, and we'll just have to see. No.
Question right here.
Thank you. It's been so refreshing and reassuring to listen to you talk, because it's so reassuring to know that there's an international correspondent and a journalist who's so knowledgeable about Brazil, which happens to be my country. And I wanted to ask you two quick questions. It relates to what you said in the beginning. To what extent do you think that that international media outlets and the Economist, which stands in the Olympus, I would say, to what extent does what the Economist write and what's out there on the international press reflect on the way that Brazilians perceive themselves? And I wanted to go back to two Economist covers, one with the Christ statue rocketing, and the other one, the rise and fall of Brazil. And of course, there's all that. There's corruption. There's bad government. But at the same time, they're spearheading political policies in a way that have been mirrored in other countries. Of course, it's all these contradictions that make us go crazy, but also make us also praise several things that are being done and have been done for even prior to Lula or to Fernando Henrique. So to what extent do you think what you write and what your colleagues write ricochet, I would say, in the country? And the second one would be, from your discourse, do you think soon enough the Economist will be endorsing Eduardo Campos as the next president?
Wow. I mean, it's gratifying, obviously, to us that we do have a profile. The Economist does have a profile in Brazil, because we've actually covered Brazil consistently. We've always taken it seriously. I mean, as I say in the book, the leading article in the very first edition of The Economist in 1843 was a call for Britain to cut its tariffs on the import of Brazilian sugar and coffee. Now, I sometimes think Brazilians take far too much notice of what the international press says, and I think it's a test of a country's self-confidence and maturity, if you like, as a democracy, when it really doesn't take that much notice. But we're talking about reactions amongst the elite, you know. Although it's been interesting, I've noticed, and this says something more about the country than us, we get more and more people kind of writing comments, Brazilians writing comments, whose English is understandable, but you know, but not perfect, let's say. And so, I mean, there are more and more people in Brazil, which traditionally has been a very kind of inward-looking country, like this country, who it's, you know, there are more and more people who are beginning to, in Brazil, who are beginning to think about the rest of the world and care about what the world thinks about them. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but those covers, you know, as I've explained to many Brazilians who say you exaggerated the first time and you exaggerated the second time. The second time it was a question. It was, has Brazil blown it? And for me, that's still a question, you know. But, you know, covers, you don't do nuance in covers. You do nuance in the editorial that I wrote on both occasions. But a cover has to have a single visual idea, you know. So, you know, that's what it was. Who will endorse? We'll decide nearer the time.
Double hand back here. Yeah, you had your hand up. Your microphone is raised.
Hi. You gave a little bit of history about Brazil and African slavery. And after 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, and Brazil assumed that the problem was solved. Today, blacks represent half of the population in Brazil, but still they do not have power. My question is, why, in your opinion, is so difficult for Brazilians to talk about race issue in Brazil and the invisibility of blacks in Brazil?
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental question, and I have quite a bit about it in the book. And I think it's true that for a long time racism was not acknowledged in Brazil. Racism exists in Brazil. It takes different forms than it takes in this country, but it exists. I think it's on the agenda in the society now in a way that it wasn't before. I think affirmative action in university entry, I think, is positive. I think it would have been better if it had been based on social criteria rather than explicitly racial criteria, because I think it would have achieved the same object, which is creating equal opportunities, irrespective of your race or your or anything else, your gender or anything else. And I think it would have done it without, because I think the fact that race is a spectrum in Brazil, that it never involves segregation, I think that's an asset for Brazil. And I think it's worth trying to hang on to that while at the same time eradicating racism, you know, and eradicating discrimination. So I think it's going to be on the agenda. I think it's arrived on the policy agenda in Brazil to stay. And I think there's a long way to go. I'm not convinced that affirmative action legislation in the labour market would be the best way of achieving it, for example, in the public sector, for example. Just because, you know, how do you define a black person in Brazil? You know, it's in some cases it's obvious. In other cases, it's not. You know, and also, do you want to create a new group of kind of vested interests? But look, I agree with you absolutely about the problem and the fact that there is racism in Brazil, and it hasn't been acknowledged historically. And it was a crucial mistake in the country's history that abolition was not followed by citizenship. No? A crucial mistake. Now, you can't undo the mistakes of the past. You can address the problems that they've left. And I think the debate in Brazil should be about the best way of redressing the problem, right?
Let me take a set of questions before, because we're going to, Adam.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for coming here and speaking. I really look forward to reading your book. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about the presence of Brazil in the international drug trade. Brazilians, and I think it's been the perception widely, that there's always been an internal problem and that the market's always been internal and that the country's never really participated in the international international trade. I believe that that's a myth. And to what extent does that participation influence the foreign policy of Brazil vis-a-vis the United States and vice versa?
Yeah,
let me just take a few more questions. That way we can wrap it up. Anyone else have any more questions?
I have a question about the indigenous population and the different political parties used for them. I worked with David Negreiros, who's Swahili, and anthropologists who worked in Mozambique, and founded cultural survival for alternatives for the indigenous population.
Okay,
I'd like to know how the current policies of the different political parties are related to the indigenous population.
In case everyone didn't hear that, how the indigenous population, how political parties, policies, and proposals are related to those. Wait for the microphone.
Actually, I just wanted to add on to the question about the drug trade. Considering that some South American countries have been pushing for reform in the states, possibly even legalization, just maybe adding on to that, what are the chances for Brazil putting pressure on the United States for action as well, considering that it would be a bigger voice than, say, Uruguay making a statement?
Anything else? There we go.
One more question.
One more, sorry.
You spoke at length about the corporate state, and it would be great to hear a little bit more about the private sector, which to some extent, by definition, overlaps with the corporate state. And I'm thinking in particular of changes in various sectors, including oil and gas, metals and mining, forestry, banking, a lot of activity with perhaps more of an export orientation.
One last question right over here. Maury, if you can make it.
Can you discuss the impact of the World Cup and Olympics in Brazil?
Okay, World Cup, the Olympics, Brazil. That's easy.
Okay. Yeah, drugs. I mean, actually, I slightly disagree with your diagnosis. I mean, I think traditionally Brazil and especially Rio was an export conduit for cocaine from Bolivia. And as a result of that, consumption started to grow in Rio, both in the favelas and in Copacabana and Ipanema and Leblon. What's happened over the past 2 decades is that consumption has really taken off in Brazil. And Brazil is now the world's second largest consumer of cocaine after the United States. And Brazil, every Brazilian city of any significance is suffering a crack epidemic. And that's one reason why crime and the murder rate, which had been dropping, has gone up again. And is one reason why the problems of policing in Rio are so acute, right? The Brazilian official response is fairly hard line on trafficking. And indeed, the society has a kind of conservative moralistic streak which may not be apparent to the casual observer, and it comes out on issues like this. And although Fernando Henrique Cardoso has publicly called for many years for the legalization of marijuana, he hasn't actually mentioned cocaine. There isn't a strong lobby for legalization within the Brazilian political system. On the contrary, I mean, it has become an element in Brazilian, a small element, but an element in Brazilian foreign policy in relation to Bolivia in particular. And you have the Brazilian federal police now operating in Bolivia, stepping into the shoes left vacant when the DEA was kicked out of the country. And I think that will continue. The indigenous population, after 4.5 centuries of decline, the numbers have actually increased over the last 30 to 40, well, 50 years, which is to do with, above all, indigenous peoples now, more of them now have secure title to their lands than was the case in the past. And indeed, quite large parts of the Amazon are indigenous reserves. There are still clashes, there are still problems. I think that the indigenous peoples face a challenge of how do they adapt to, if you like, the modern world on their own terms. Some of them do it more successfully than others. I think they all face the problem of how do they, particularly for their young people, who want the same as other young Brazilians. And is that compatible with their traditional lifestyle? And that's a dilemma for indigenous peoples everywhere, I think. The private sector, I think the private sector is, it's a remarkable spectrum, and you have some extraordinary companies in Brazil, very innovative ones. I mean, Embraer is the best known, but there are many others. I have a section, I have a few paragraphs about a company called Vegi, which I'm sure most people haven't heard of, which is a company that makes electric motors and power units, and it's up there with Siemens and GE as one of the most important companies in the world in its niche, and it's a great company, and it's in Brazil, and it makes a profit in Brazil, and then you have these kind of industries which prefer to kind of go actually all Brazilian industry, is addicted to subsidized loans from the government, and I think that's a problem. I think it needs to change. I would highlight as kind of centers of excellence and centers of and sort of sectors with a great future, particularly agribusiness and oil and gas, despite heavy-handed regulation. There's a growing science base in Brazil, which is starting to reflect in technology, but there's a long way to go. I talk a bit about the shoe industry, which is interesting, because the shoe industry kind of began to export in the 1970s. It then ran into all kinds of problems. But there are now kind of 3 big shoe companies in Brazil that have formed successful international brands. Havaianas and Azaleia, for example. Havaianas is an amazing story. They're flogging for $200 a piece of kind of rubber, and they charge more for it because it's made in Brazil, right? That's, Brazil needs more companies like Alpargatas that makes Havaianas, no? But there's a big problem of competitiveness in many sectors, no? And the economy is too closed. Brazil has the lowest import quotient of any economy of its any of the major economies in the world by far, no? And that needs to change. And then lastly, I think I've talked a bit about the World Cup and the Olympics. I do think when the government went into it, I'm sure they thought this was going to be the kind of crowning jewel in Brazil's coming out as emergence onto the world stage. It hasn't quite worked out like that. I think so far clearly it's been negative for the Brazil brand. I think the final judgment is not in. I think it will be less negative than it is now, but I think on balance it probably won't be enormously positive. But Brazil is a country with a lot of soft power. There's a poll out today from Pew which shows that quite a lot of people around the world have a rather positive image of Brazil. It's a country that attracts. It's a country with lots of problems, but it's a country that has lots of attractive features as well.
Well, and then I have to ask, who do you think is going to win the World Cup? Is it going to be like, whom are you going to endorse? You're going to wait until it's... As many people have been reminded recently, in 1950, Brazil
when the World Cup was last hosted in Brazil. Brazil was the best team in the world and was winning 1-0 in the final game with 15 minutes to go, and Uruguay scored 2 goals. Why do you think that's not going to happen this time? I mean, if Luis Suarez's hamstring holds up. No, actually, I think Brazil has quite a good chance of winning it. I think it's between Brazil, Germany, and Argentina. I think Spain are past it. I think the fancied outsiders are Belgium, but they'll bottle to use. I mean, they'll choke to. I think because to win the World Cup, you need, as Brazilians say, tradição, and not many countries have it in football. And so I think Uruguay has it. But I mean, I think Brazil, Germany, or Argentina. If it's Argentina winning 6-0, Nossa Senhora.
Let me say about the book, actually, just in closing, is that what is true of your last book and this one is, this is remarkably well researched. What's amazing is you have a primary source research, interviews, newspaper clippings, academic articles, econometric analyses. What's remarkable about it is it's written by a journalist, but it actually reads more like a professor who writes like a journalist. The amount of detail is just remarkable. Really.
Well, thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking Michael, and he'll be here to sign books.
Thank you very much.